Let's talk more about all of this with Victoria Coates, National Security Vice President at the Heritage Foundation. So President Trump said that he wants to go straight to some kind of a peace deal and bypass any kind of a ceasefire. What do you think about that proposal, Victoria?
Well, John, good to be with you. I think the president is correctly frustrated with attempts at ceasefires in Gaza, for example, attempts at ceasefires here. He wants to get to a final deal. He wants to get to a resolution of this war, not something that, might hold for a couple of days and then you've got to go back in. So I think that's why he wants to get to a more substantive negotiation. That's what he did last night on the phone. Very important that we had Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, not just the Prime Minister of the UK, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of France, and of course the President of Ukraine, but also the NATO Secretary General on the line to talk about what these security guarantees for Ukraine might look like. And I think that's where the president is headed with this. He wants a final deal and he wants security for Ukraine.
Senator Tom Cotton, who knows quite a bit about foreign relations, says that he thinks a ceasefire is going to have to be in the cards. Listen.
I think the first step is going to be a ceasefire. We didn't have that today, but hopefully in the weeks ahead, especially if the presidents of Ukraine and Russia can sit down, there'll be a ceasefire, which can stop the killing at least temporarily, and then move on to that durable peace settlement.
So which is it going to be? I mean, if you expect that there's going to be some kind of a ceasefire first, does it take that much longer to get a durable peace agreement?
No, I think that's what the president is framing. And I don't think I'm actually crossways with Senator Cotton, because that's a dangerous place to be, John. Nobody ever wants to be there. But no, I mean, obviously, stopping the shooting is part, a ceasefire is going to be part of any deal. I just think the president doesn't want to make that the end all be all and not be thinking about what the final resolution to the conflict will be.
But Vladimir Putin doesn't yet have what he wants. I mean, he wants big chunks of Ukrainian territory. So what's his motivation to stop fighting if he doesn't have what he wants?
Well, this is what we're going to see play out in coming days, because you're going to have the president go back, assess the situation. I know he'll be meeting with his top advisors through the day tomorrow in advance of the meeting with Zelensky. Then we'll have some number of the big four, Italy, Germany, UK, France, joining that meeting either in person or virtually on Monday in Washington, and hammering out what their next steps are. And if President Zelensky is satisfied with the kind of security guarantees he is being granted, and that's why I think it's so important that NATO is part of this. And I would expect to see the Secretary General, for example, there as well, that he is not going to be joining NATO. There are reasons for that. Ukraine doesn't meet the requirements for membership in NATO as much as one might want to have them in there. But that doesn't mean NATO can't contribute. Now, so I think you've seen Putin shift a little bit on external peacekeepers in Ukraine. That's very important. That could give Zelensky a lot of confidence, especially if there's a serious discussion about what the eastern border of Ukraine, wherever that line is going to be drawn, what that looks like in terms of its security. Because I think all NATO members are concerned about NATO's eastern front with Russia bordering on Finland, Estonia, Poland, et cetera. They're going to have to do a lot of work there as well.
Do you see Putin giving up this fight if he doesn't get any Ukrainian territory?
Well, the short answer is I don't know. I think that the president does reserve the right to put some very significant economic sanctions and measures on Russia. He didn't play that card yesterday. Some people were disappointed, but Putin knows that's there. He knows the dangers to his economy. He knows the weakness of his economy. And what I would love to see is the president pick up the phone, call Prime Minister Modi of India, and talk to him about how he's going to get him off of those 2 million barrels a day that India had bought from Russia last month. Who is going to supply that product to our great partner and ally, India? It could be Saudi Arabia, it could be the UAE, it could be Kuwait, it could be the United States, it could be a combination thereof. But I think that's how we actually get Putin to modify his behavior, cut off the folks who are still importing his energy. Then he's going to have to talk.
Victoria Coates at the Heritage Foundation. Victoria, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.